I'm glad to have the opportunity today to talk to you about what's going on at Interfaith Community Services. To paraphrase a well-known expression attributed to Mark Twain, the reports of our death have been greatly exaggerated. I'm Kent Grubbs, and on July 1st, I became the board chair of Interfaith Community Services. And if you've been reading the papers, you know that a lot's been going on with our organization since that date. But I'm here to tell you today that we are alive and kicking in several different areas. With respect to our current operations, we currently run 3 programs. Firstly, our Showers to Go program takes a mobile hygiene unit to 3 locations in Santa Fe every week, where we provide hot showers, a sack lunch, toilet facilities, and case management services to our unhoused clients. In the 3 months from July through September of 2025, about 250 people avail themselves of these services. Secondly, we run a seniors motel program at the Days Inn on Cerrillos Road, where about 25 unhoused seniors receive a room, a hot meal, and case management services designed to get them into permanent supportive housing. And finally, we continue to serve as the fiscal agent of Consuelo's Place, a non-congregate shelter located on the Midtown campus. But I think it's fair to say that our real focus nowadays is on building a new resource outreach center for the homeless in Santa Fe. Interfaith came to the view several years ago that our old location at 2801 Cerrillos Road, commonly known as Pete's Place, was not a viable long-term option for the provision of our services or for the services that we intended to provide in the future. So beginning about a year ago, we started planning in earnest for a new facility in a new location designed using trauma-informed principles that is purpose-built for the specific needs of the Santa Fe community. We call this facility the Resource and Opportunity Center, or the ROC for short. So, what exactly is the ROC? Well, the ROC is being designed to address 3 significant gaps in Santa Fe's homelessness response system. Firstly, the ROC will provide expanded shelter capacity. There are currently about 280 emergency shelter beds in Santa Fe, a number that hasn't appreciably changed in at least 5 years and probably longer. And those 280 beds are intended to serve a population that at a minimum is 400 people and probably a lot bigger. So in one fell swoop, the ROC can increase the shelter bed capacity in Santa Fe by almost 50%. And we're looking at a hybrid model with respect to bedding where congregate, semi-congregate, and non-congregate options are available to our guests, choices that suit the particular needs of our particular community. Secondly, the ROC will serve as a day center where people can have their daily needs met during regular business hours, regardless of whether they spent the night with us or not. A place where people can get a hot meal, get a shower, do their laundry, have access to the internet, kennel their dogs, get their electronic devices charged, receive free distributed clothing, and so many other things. Right now, there is not such a place in Santa Fe for our unhoused guests. And that's one of the main reasons why you see people lugging their belongings on the sidewalks up and down Cerrillos Road and elsewhere. These folks simply don't have a place to go during the day to get off the streets, to get out of the weather, and to just be. The ROC will provide that service. And finally, the ROC is envisaged to be a centralized services hub, a one-stop shop where our partner service organizations can engage our guests directly with life-stabilizing services, such as medical care, behavioral health services, housing navigation, drug and alcohol treatment, and others. And when I say one-stop shop, what I mean is that employees of our partner organizations, such as the LifeLink, La Familia Medical Center, Santa Fe Recovery Center, will have their employees physically located with us at the Rock on our campus so that they can engage directly with our clients to provide the services that their organizations provide. You know, it's just not good enough for a case manager at Interfaith to sit down with a client, make an appointment for that client, say at St. Elizabeth's near the rail yard, and then expect that client to get themselves to St. Elizabeth's and show up at the appointed hour. We have to defeat the tyranny of distance by having a physical location where partner organizations and our clients are at the same place at the same time. That's what other leading edge facilities do, such as Haven for Hope in San Antonio or the Gateway Center in Albuquerque. In this way, the Rock can serve as the front door to Santa Fe's homelessness response system, because Interfaith doesn't operate in isolation. We're part of a broader system with other local agencies, each playing a unique role with their unique service offerings for the benefit of our unhoused clients. And I'm happy to say that our partner service organizations want to participate with Interfaith in this brave new undertaking, because homelessness affects everyone in our community. Our residents, of course, but business owners, tourists, first responders, emergency rooms. Just about everyone in our town is affected in one way or another by homelessness. So the Rock isn't just another shelter. It's an entirely different concept, one that is intended to provide a community solution to a community challenge. And it's not just about the building. We're taking this opportunity to re-examine every aspect of our service delivery model. And in that vein, we visited with experts from facilities in Houston, in San Antonio, in Albuquerque, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Denver to gain insights on their operations and import those best practices to Santa Fe. You'll be hearing more about the Rock in the coming weeks and months as we begin our public engagement process. You know, Santa Fe has a huge need, and for sure, the Rock is a huge undertaking for Interfaith. But we also have a huge opportunity. What we are envisaging is something that Santa Fe has never yet seen, but desperately needs. Other cities have done it, and so can we. So please join us. Be part of this journey to serve the least of these. In the meantime, I encourage you to go to our website, www.interfaithsheltersf.org, and sign up for our newsletter communications so that you can be kept abreast of our ongoing activities as well as planning for the Rock. Again, I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Thanks so much for your attention, and I wish you a blessed day.